if we choose the road which is in accordance with common sense, which would lead to prosperity, well-being and dignity for human beings, we had to choose one road. And if we want to continue to pursue our way towards destruction, we would just choose the opposite road. And, well, this is the situation. We have to choose, and we have to choose, and we have to show ourselves to be responsible human beings by showing ourselves capable of choosing.
Could you tell me in your personal reminiscences whether you can think of an experience or a person which was a catalyst for you that motivated you to take this path that led you to begin to learn an enormous amount about armaments, for example, as a woman. You weren't trained to do that necessarily, but you took that path, you made that commitment, which is different than most women traditionally have done. And you've also made a commitment to this disarmament issue to influence people. Was there a moment when you made that kind of a decision, something that affected you deeply?
Well, without referring to any particular individual person, I would say that in my very young days, before the Second World War, I became awake to the tremendous problems that the world would face if we didn't stop the movements that during the late 1930s were at hand. The Nazi regime in West Germany and all that they gave as a result in around the world. And that was when I became internationally committed. Then I had a number of years in domestic policy in Sweden.
Was there a moment, was there a time, an incident that you can recall where you began
No
to
concrete
feel
incidents. The whole development of the 1930s were of that character, that it made young people who wanted to do something, to contribute to something, to understand that it has to be made in an international context. But then, as I said, I devoted quite a number of years of my political life to domestic issues in Sweden. But in the 1950s, something happened which really meant a lot of things, not only to me, but to women in Sweden generally. I happened at that time to be the elected chairman of the Social Democratic Women's League in Sweden, which is an independent movement of women within the Social Democratic Party. And in the middle of the 1950s, we became aware that the military leaders in Sweden wanted to have nuclear weapons included in Swedish defense, and we were technologically advanced enough to be able to produce them ourselves. We took an immediate decision, and that was very spontaneous, I would say almost very emotional. We are going to say no. At that time we had a social democratic government in Sweden. I as a chairman, as some of my colleagues, went to the Prime Minister and said, you must know that whatever plans the military leaders have, whatever feelings you have in the government, we are going to say no. And we are going to resist this sort of request from the military leaders. 1 year later, a tremendous debate started in Sweden on nuclear weapons in Swedish defense. And because of our position taken, I became, as chairman of the Social Democratic Women's League, immensely involved in the public debate, in every kind of media, with politicians, with newspaper editorial writers, with military leaders, heads of regiments, and so on. And I had to learn. I had to learn every aspect of the use of nuclear weapons in a country like Sweden, a neutral country, surrounded by military pacts like that. What possible use could a nuclear weapon in Swedish defense have, and what would be the effect of nuclear weapons in Swedish defense? And we learned our lesson. We were able to argue in substance with the military leaders. And gradually there was an uphill battle, but we won. Parliament took in 1960s the decision not to include nuclear weapons in Swedish defense, and for Sweden's part to ratify the Non-Proliferation Treaty, by which we are committed not to have access to nuclear weapons. So this was a tremendous experience, because I learned that you can have an emotional reaction at the first stage, But if you are really going to pursue this matter up to victory, you have to learn the hard facts. And this was what we did.
Now these were, what is interesting to me about this is these were a group of women. Do you think
Yes.
that was significant? Why would you say it was a group of women that effected this, and just that it was, but there are many groups of men that also could have, but it was a group of women. And that's a very powerful statement to make, I think.
But that was a very particular reason. There were many men who joined us,
Later.
and who even said to me that they wanted to become members of the Social Democratic Women's League in order to feel involved in that. But you know, it was just that at the proper moment, we as an independent organization within the party happened to get to know about these plans. And as we were a women's organization, naturally, we were women who took that decision.
But do you think that that might have anything to do with being able to feel an emotional reaction, and then to experience and to seek the knowledge? I mean, is there something?
Yes,
in that?
I would agree, but there were many men who reacted in the same emotional way. None of us knew very much about the effects on Swedish defense, Swedish sovereignty and Swedish neutrality if we acquired nuclear weapons. We had to learn that. It was just that we said, because during the early 50s, we had, and many other organizations in Sweden, directed our protests to the international community because we saw what happened in the United States, in the Soviet Union. We saw the testing of increasingly effective nuclear bombs. And we tried to arouse the United Nations. There were many others who worked together with us on that. But when it came to our own territory, where we were the decision makers as politicians, we said to ourselves, now we have the possibility to influence events.
So you were in touch with your own power.
Oh, yes.
And you acted with it.
Yes, we did.
In fact, I wasn't even sure that disarmament was a very viable subject. I said to myself, I will give it 2 or 3 years of my effort, and then I will do something else. And what happened to me was to realize that this subject had to do with every other subject. It had to do with economics, it had to do with the economy of the United States, it had to do with the relations among states, it had to do with everything. And my work in the Senate in directing the studies of this subcommittee brought me to realize that it was an all-encompassing subject. Now, and have believed this for the past 25 years, believe it's the most important question facing the people of this country, and in fact facing the people of the world, but particularly this country, because this country is the greatest power. It has the greatest military, economic power combined, and therefore it has to be the leader in any effort to achieve progress toward disarmament. It really means that without the people of the United States really pushing ahead of the government to do something about this issue, we are never going to solve the problem.
Okay. I may not have a very dramatic answer. You would probably want me to say that I had set my heart on transforming the world and put it in a better shape, and that I was driven by a sense of power to be in the area of international politics and security. Those, in my case, are not true. I just happened to wander into the field of international relations, and from there into strategy, and from there to disarmament. I can only plead guilty to the charge that I loved studying, and after having studied, I wanted a career. And that's how it started. Linda, value is a very value-laden term, and a part of my cultural background is that each society is entitled to its own value system, that we don't prescribe quick fixes how to do it. That's very alien to my culture. Shortcuts to slimming, crash courses on dieting, how to make bombs. I mean, these things don't come very naturally to my culture. So I would be very reluctant to say what the rest of the world should do, and I have got a quick fix for it. But I do seriously think that it's not as if these countries are not aware of the problems that are being faced for them. In fact, it's go to the credit of these countries that they openly discuss them, that they bring them out in public, that there is a well-informed public quite aware of what is happening, And the best I can say is, if I were to say, what would you tell a crowd to appeal to it, to divert resources from disarmament to development within the industrialized world and among the industrialized and the developing countries? I would say something very simple, which I read recently, that the resources that we are preempting from socio-productive purposes, we are not merely spoiling an inheritance, we are depriving the future generation of its legacy. And for that, no value has to change. It could be said in any language, in any country.
Well, the matter of fact is that I paid my first visit in my lifetime to Japan to attend a symposium. And when I was there, I asked permission to be taken down to Hiroshima. I wanted to see with my own eyes the type of appearance of a city that was devastated 32 years ago by one small, primitive first nuclear bomb. And I went through the whole Peace Park, the Peace Memorial Museum. I saw some films. I spoke to people, victims, surviving victims from the 6th of August 1945. I put a wreath at the Peace Memorial Monument, and then I quoted silently for myself the inscription on that Peace Memorial Monument, and that was, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." And that is something to remember today when we have 60,000 nuclear warheads spread around the world, every one of them much stronger than the Hiroshima bomb.
How do we do?
During the second special session on disarmament by the General Assembly, more than 1,000 Japanese will come here, and a great number of them from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, led by the two mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I met myself, Mayor Araki of Hiroshima. He was present in Hiroshima at 6th of August 1945 and is one of the survivors. And I hope that these Japanese people coming here will meet with as many as possible of the American people to make them understand what really a nuclear weapon means. You know, what has struck me is the fact that political leaders and military leaders show so little of imagination or knowledge of what is really a nuclear weapon. And you can see it every day in the debate in this country, where prominent political leaders speak about a possible future nuclear war in terms that you just don't understand how their brains are functioning. And this is in my view one of the greatest dangers for a development which none of us really would have. That they speak about a protracted nuclear war, they speak about a limited nuclear war. They don't understand what a nuclear war is like. They don't understand what one nuclear weapon is like. And this is because of that people who have experienced it themselves and people who have been there and seen what it means would have to speak out. I think that very many people who are aware of what happened and what could easily happen in a proportion which is unbelievable, absolutely, for any one of us, shy away from it because they feel that it is unthinkable. And because of that, they don't want to touch it in their own minds, in their own hearts. And I think this is among the attitudes that have to be changed. People must think about the unthinkable, and one reason for that is that the way in which nuclear doctrines, the theories on how nuclear weapons could be used in the future war, have developed in such a way that the political and military leaders have made the unthinkable thinkable. Because of that, people have to think about it. And this is why one of the popular movements at present, which is so important in this respect, to make people change their attitudes and values as far as a nuclear arms race is concerned, is the movement among doctors. To make people understand from the field of competence that the doctors represent what really a nuclear war would be like. You know, for decades, no one has said a word about that. people have just sit about, well, nuclear weapons are necessary for our security, our political leaders tell us that this is a fact, we must develop more modernized, more effective nuclear weapons. They have not thought about, they have not used their imagination to try to understand what is really a nuclear weapon.
One of the reasons that, as I try to suggest, that Europe feels differently than we do is that the degree of economic interdependence is much greater. And one of the things that will help us even as the interdependence grows and is realized. I mean, we only have about 15% of our trade, you know, that's exported, or our production that's exported. In Europe, it's like 50%. So interdependence is a good part of this. Another part is simply realizing that we are going to have to share power. That, for example, the idea that you have 5 permanent members in the United Nations, and they are the ones to control and have a veto over everything, that has to change. Everyone at the United Nations, probably except with the exception of the United States and the Soviet Union, knows that that system has to change. And when they reach the point, they will force that change, in which 5 countries will no longer have a veto. That's part of it. I think we'll go through a period in which there will be a lot more regionalism, where countries will work together in regions because they can do more there than go to a global place where 2 powers are, first they have vetoes, and secondly they're not willing to work together. Now there are areas that where the Soviet Union and the United States have worked together. And if I might mention some of those, which shows that is not such a bleak picture. For example, if you ask any Russian what was the best period of U.S.-Soviet relationship, they will say the years of the early 70s. This is when President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger negotiated the SALT I agreement with the Russians, negotiated some trade agreements. That was the period in which we, in a sense, treated the Russians with a sense of equality, which is really what they want, a sense that they have also made it, and they have a very serious inferiority complex, and they wanted to be treated as equal. That period, more people were allowed out of the Soviet Union, especially Jews. It was done in a quiet, diplomatic way. And I think women have a special role to play. And I think this is so for a number of reasons, some of which you can't prove. Partly, it's first that women have been left out. They have not made any of the decisions. And so I think women can come fresh. If I can illustrate it by saying something about the Vietnam War, when President Johnson took over from President Kennedy, he inherited all the same advisors, and therefore they just continued what they were doing before. Now, women have not inherited any of the hang-ups that men have had, any of the confrontations, the egos, the macho-ness, and I think that therefore women can, using both their sensibilities and their intellect, can approach the matter from a different perspective.
And what in your experience would be a different shading? What qualitatively would be different? Like, I know you've spoken about a woman's own rationality, her own kinds of insights. Can you be more descriptive about that, in perhaps drawing on your own experience, something that you've experienced?
Well, I think the factor of pride, ego is a factor here. I would even talk about more trying to achieve something. When I look back of all the efforts in the government and see to what extent really people were trying, I don't think they were trying. I know how hard we had to work to get a particular piece of legislation to set up the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in the Congress, and we used every technique we could think of. Then I looked at what we were doing to try to get a limited test ban, or for a comprehensive test ban, and we only got a limited test ban. What we were trying to get in the way of real reductions in a comprehensive disarmament program. Some of the times the government didn't even give the full position out that was authorized to give. Sometimes that the final position that the government was achieved was so small, the lowest common denominator. People didn't use enough guts, you might say, to reach the president. The president looks at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and if the Joint Chiefs of Staff says we're going to, we won't approve it, then the president says, no, I can't face the Congress if the Joint Chiefs are not with me. Well, if there were women around to take the place of that, then we would give courage to the president. In other words, I'm trying to say the president needs the courage of a bunch of women around the country to really do something.
I also try to tell you that development is not merely staving off hunger. Now, the remarkable thing that study has done is to project development as a global requirement, that the industrialized world is as much in need of freeing the resources which they are currently deploying to the arms race for their own purposes as the developing countries need them. And we say that in that study by saying that the industrialized countries have faced problems of unemployment, of inflation, of slow returns on productivity. They have also faced situations of labor shortage, of constraints on capital formation, and the industrialized world is facing this kind of situation partly because it has been the major spender in the military sector. Also related to that, a major conclusion of that study is that resources are not mere finances. It's not merely money. Resources mean human resources, that is labor. It means material resources like capital and technology. It also means natural resources like fuel and non-fuel minerals. And resources are far from infinite. No country, howsoever economically powerful it may be today, can indefinitely keep on squandering its less than infinite resources into the military sector without suffering from its consequences. And in fact, some of the economists believe that the downward trend in global economy, which we have noticed since mid and late 70s, may be partly a result of major military outlays by the industrialized world. For the developing countries, again economists say that when an economy has got underutilized resources or unutilized resources, then any kind of spending can lead to a short-term stimulation of its economic growth. And that's why in the short term, these countries, the developing or the less industrialized countries, may not see the negative consequences, but they should learn from the experience of the industrialized world, which today is facing a downward trend in its economy. The basic appeal of the report is that it is not an emotional analysis of the subject. Please don't spend on the military, give it to the hungry of the world. The powerful of the world are not going to disarm because of the poor of the world are hungry. They would disarm because their economies cannot sustain it. They would disarm because the arms race is leading them towards war. They would disarm because the people in these countries are becoming aware of the unbearability and, let's say, the irrelevance of the socio-economic burdens they have borne in the past because the arms race has not purchased security. This is where the report has tried to establish a triangular relationship between disarmament, development and security, which involves both the industrialized and the developing countries. And if some of the resources now claimed by the arms race are transferred into developmental channels, it's not an act of charity. It's not a donor-recipient relationship. Because many of these resources which I mentioned to you, the developing countries are rich in them. Many of them don't have capital and technology, but many of them have raw materials and labor.
I'm convinced that it does need, after all these decades of the nuclear era, it does require a change of heart based on an added knowledge of what we are all about. If you combine these two factors, I think that miracles could happen.